Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and this is a slightly off-the-wall video. This one does a slightly strange recording. This doesn't really have any particular place. This is not part of the Ages of Chaos. This is not Strange Playgrounds. This is not the Fluff and Hammer. This is its own little thing. I recently got the new starter set for Warhammer Age of Sigmar 2.0, and I have to say, it's an odd thing, but it's part of my history with Games Workshop. I've always been more interested in Warhammer 40,000. I've always been more interested in the science fiction setting than the fantasy setting for numerous reasons. I mean, the original fantasy setting, the old world or the world that was, although it certainly had its own charm and there were elements of it I adored. I mean, one of the first stories I ever read in any Games Workshop universe was the story of Nagash and his rise to power in Nehekhara, and his eventual immortality, his becoming sort of the uber lord of all death magic, of all necromancy. That was the first story I ever read, and it's always resonated with me. It's one that I've gone back to again and again and again, and have always enjoyed. That said, the fantasy setting, the old world, never really snared me as much as the science fiction setting did. The reason being, I believe, because the old world, the world that was much more prey to its influences and its inspirations than the Warhammer 40,000 universe, although it's definitely the case that both universes are and were big polyglot grab bags of various bits of media and influence, ranging from romantic poetry to ancient mythology and folklore tales, from Lord of the Rings to Michael Moorcock to Lovecraft. All of these influences are prevalent within both systems. I find that the Warhammer 40,000 universe, because of its sheer scope and its scale, has more potential. It was always more open and freeing in a fictional sense. In the Warhammer 40,000 universe, because it is a universe of various planets and systems, and it's huge, it's massively expansive. In storytelling terms, you can do truly apocalyptic and zeitgeist-changing things without damaging the overall universe or the overall mythology. So, in the fiction, for example, you can have planets being blown up, you can have entire species being annihilated and civilizations being destroyed. In the old world, or the world that wasn't necessarily the case. It was once it was set down on a map, for example, it was very bounded. Its history and its nature was very bounded, and it was very difficult to do anything of significance there without totally upsetting the gaming system, the mythology, everything really. And as a result, it was kind of limited, it was kind of finite, and we saw that. We saw that in the original Storm of Chaos campaign, where Chaos unambiguously won that. They unambiguously won. By all accounts, after that campaign, there should have been a sort of post-apocalyptic setting where Archaon was sat on the throne of Altdorf, and the Empire was no more, and what you had was scattered bands of humanity and of the other species fighting back against the dominance of Chaos. But that never happened because the gaming system and the setting was so finite and so limited, bounded by its situation and its nature. They retconned it so that Chaos didn't really win and nothing really changed very much and everything went back to the status quo. And that aspect, the fact that it was so bounded, and also that it was so prey to its influences. I mean, the influence of Tolkien and Lovecraft and Moorcock are very clear, or were very clear in the old world. It never ever really got me as much as Warhammer 40,000. The same is true of the gaming systems as well. As problematic as the gaming systems for Warhammer 40,000 have been, I've always found them more freeing and more potent than those for the original Fantasy Battle. The original Fantasy Battle, before the advent of AOS, was very much a game of tactics over strategy. So if you could maneuver your army into a particular position in the first couple of turns, you were likely to win. I also found the way that everything was organised into regiments kind of stultifying from a modelling perspective. Models and miniatures had to be in a particular situation because they had to fit into regiments. You couldn't have the more elaborate conversions that you have in Warhammer 40,000's looser, more squad-based system. Now, the advent of AOS, the end times and the advent of AOS completely changed that. It completely changed that. First of all, I found the fact that they changed everything so dramatically intriguing. And okay, early on, AOS was difficult to get a grasp on because there was this sense of just flinging everything at the wall to seeing what sticks. And some things worked and some things didn't. So I was sort of meh at the beginning of AOS. I wasn't that bothered, especially since at that time Warhammer 40,000 was starting to get good again. They were starting to introduce things like the Gene Stealer cults and like the resurrected Thousand Sons, the Primarchs were coming back. So it was just more interesting back then. That said, I did keep up with the fiction. I did keep up with what was happening in the mortal realms as they came to be known. But back then, at the beginning of AOS, it was very difficult to get a bead on exactly what was happening. They referred to the mortal realms. They kind of loosely referred to how they were organised and how they were structured, but it was very difficult to get a bead on how they worked, what they actually were, what was the metaphysics of this universe, because it was never really set down in stone. It was never really described as such. Like, for example, how do they situate to one another? That wasn't known back then. We knew that they were like overlapping realms, and there were these gates that would allow you to pass from one to the other, and that they were coalesced around the winds of magic, so they were elemental. Very much like the metaphysical realms of D&D, for example. They remind me very much of Planescape. They remind me very much of Planescape, the way the realms are organised. And that sustained, although we started to get more detail as the battle tomes were released and as the fiction expanded. It was very difficult to get a bead on how it worked, how it functioned, what was actually happening. 2.0, the advent of AOS 2.0 has completely changed that. The book itself, the actual core book, is well worth getting. It's well worth getting because it's so fascinating. The rules I'm not that concerned about. The rules are quite good, actually, for AOS 2.0. They're very concise, but detailed enough to get a satisfying game out of. But that's really not the point of this book. The point of this book, I mean, really, they're just refinements. They're not a new rule set or anything like that. They're not dramatic. They're just refinements and ways of detailing and expanding the existing rule set and just clarifying a few things. The big thing with 2.0 is that they have tried to coalesce and crystallize the mythology a little bit so that you have an idea of how the realms work, of how the mortal realms function. It's not even a cosmos, it's a metaphysics. I mean, they are elemental, these realms, these states of being, and we have explicit descriptions and diagrams of how they work as a state of being, a collective state of being, and how they relate to one another, but also in a detailed sense of how each of the realms functions, how their civilizations occur, how they're organized geographically in terms of their topography, how they change and shift in response to certain cosmological forces. So these realms are not static. Okay, they are not like the old world was. They actually constantly transform in response to various different factors, not least of which are the tides and currents of the winds of magic themselves. They can be changed, and powerful enough beings can forcibly change their state. Sigmar has done it a couple of times, and Nagash has certainly done it with Sheesh, and Alariel has too, but just not to the same degree. They are metaphorical states. They're more like abstract states that have coalesced around particular ideas or notions or concepts. So they are very much like the realms of chaos used to be, but an expansion of that metaphysics. So now, in the old world, it was the case that chaos was the metaphysics of that world. Nagash found that out, and that's why he created necromancy, so that he could save humanity from the powers of chaos, from its inevitable doom, which was any living thing in that state of being. When it dies, its essence, its soul, immediately goes to chaos, no matter what it worships, no matter what faith it has. They immediately just go to chaos and feed the chaos powers, become fodder, basically. And Nagash found that out, which is why he created necromancy, which is a means of anchoring the soul to the physical remains, and made himself immortal and beyond the reach of chaos. But now that's not the case anymore. Now the Chaos powers, although they are the most powerful deities out there and the most prominent metaphysics, they're not the only one. This is potentially the state of play in the new mortal realms is not mortal at all, funnily enough. It's actually it's a game of gods. It's an ever-expanding and infinite metaphysics. Potentially, there are any number of new gods in this system. New gods can be formed. They can be fashioned. They can shape themselves. I mean, that's what Morothai is trying to do. Morothai has recognized the metaphysics of this new state, and she's realized that through certain actions, a mortal entity can become like her son, like Malerion, or like Nagash, or like Alariel, or like Tyrion and Teclis. They can actually become vessels for a particular kind of divinity and become divine themselves, and that's what Morothai is trying to do. The metaphysics of the mortal realms of AOS is far more fluid and interesting than that for the old world was. We saw that at the beginning with the imprisonment of Slaanesh. We now have this situation whereby even the pantheon of chaos, which is the prime metaphysics from which all others derive, can be upset. It can be forcibly altered or transformed. And now we have this wonderful state where Slaanesh is straining to get free and will, I have no doubt, will explode across the mortal realms, hopefully very soon. But that's wonderful, isn't it? It makes the games that much more dynamic. It makes the metaphysics of the game and also just the state of play so changeable. As we have seen with 2.0, the whole situation has changed. The whole situation has changed. 2.0 has altered the state of play so that Nagash is kind of the prime mover. He's the big enemy, not Chaos at the moment. Although the Chaos powers are definitely still there, definitely still a threat. It's really Nagash who's the problem at the moment, and death magic. The whole metaphysics of this cosmology, if you like, has been upset by Nagash's experiments in Sheesh. So now death magic pervades everywhere. It's seeping into all the other realms and polluting it. So death is now... The laws of life and death have changed. So there are now ghosts and spirits and zombies and things everywhere. Everywhere. And this is wonderful. I imagine this is what they're trying to do with this system and with Warhammer 40,008 8th edition. They are trying to introduce a new dynamic system whereby every so many years or so they can upset the status quo to keep it fresh, to keep it interesting. Because that was the problem with the old world. It was static, it was stolid, it was stagnant. It was totally stagnant. There was nothing you could do. There was no storytelling to be done in that world, unfortunately, at the end, other than to end it, other than to upset it and destroy it, which is what they did. But for the first time ever, I'm really excited by the fantasy setting, because now the fantasy setting is not only more changeable, it not only has far more variety, it has a state of play that's as infinite in storytelling and mythological terms as the Warhammer 40,000 universe, if not more so. There are maps of the mortal realms in the new book, and there are details of how they work and what their civilizations are, but those maps are massive and also changeable. The mortal realms change all the time. There are new portions of them cropping up all over the place. Sheesh, for example, as new belief systems and new notions of the afterlife come about, then new portions of Sheesh coalesce and become those afterlives. So these realms are infinite. You can do what you like with them in storytelling terms. The civilizations and tribes of men, of humanity, of orcs, of ogrins, of undead things, they're everywhere. They're everywhere and they're all different. So you have, as a storyteller, and as an army builder, in fact, because as an army builder, you are kind of a storyteller. You are kind of telling the story of your force through your miniatures. You can do what you like. What if you wanted to do, like, for example, a cult of Tzeentch manipulators that come from the realm of life, for example? So they are from the Disciples of Tzeentch book, but they're not like the Disciples of Tzeentch as they are popularly represented. They're not from civilization. They're actually from the tribes of the realm of life. That would be fascinating and would present some fantastic modelling and storytelling opportunities. By the same example, Akshi, the realm of fire, is usually associated with Khorne because it's so fiery and so aggressive and it's tribal. But there are civilizations cropping up there now. There are temples and cities and vast, vast empires there. What if there's one of them that's dedicated to Slaanesh? What if they translate the fieriness of Akshi as passion and as aesthetics and as desire, as inspiration? I mean, there's so much you could do. There's so much you could do here. It's wonderful. And that state didn't exist in the old world, unfortunately. That state did not exist. You were much more bound as storytellers and as an army builders by just the setting, by the nature of the setting, and how prescribed it was, as compared to AOS, where nothing is prescribed, where you have almost free reign. In modelling terms, you can do whatever the hell you like, and the stories you can tell. I cannot wait now. I've always enjoyed the Black Library stuff based in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. There's a lot of good stuff set in the Warhammer 40,000 universe. I haven't read much that was set in the old world that was really any good, and I mean genuinely good. Some of it was fun, but not much of it was genuinely good. It was tended to be sort of like more cocky and semi-Tolkien-esque high fantasy, and that's it really, sort of with shades of D&D thrown in. That's not the case anymore. I think that there now could be a push from the Black Library to tell stories in the mortal realms that are at least as ambiguous, as complex, as interesting, and as well told as those in the Warhammer 40,000 setting. I think that's the potential is huge. The potential is massive. For one thing, writers can now create whatever they like. They can create their own little settings, their own little civilizations, their own tribes, their own cultures and whatnot. It's much more potent in storytelling terms. And aesthetically as well, I much prefer AOS aesthetically to the derivative, in fact, aesthetics of the old world, because the old world was largely informed by inspirations, by pre-existing inspirations. So it was D&D, it was Tolkien, it was Michael Moorcock, and all of that stuff, it was Lovecraft. All of that stuff is very evident in the old world. Not anymore. Not anymore. The new aesthetics of AOS is far more abstract. It's far more Roger Dean, if anything. It's far more prog rock album cover. It's with shades of steampunk and Giga and all of this wonderful stuff all thrown in. It's quite wonderful. The potential in this setting is huge. It's absolutely enormous, far more so from my perspective than that of the old world. And for the first time ever, I'm excited. And I want to be involved. There's so many armies I would love to collect for AOS, and I've never been that inspired before. I've never been that inspired. I like them all. I even like the ones I used to powerfully dislike back in the old world, like most of the Elven Armies, for example. Back in the old world, most of the Elven Armies were just Tolkien elves, and that was it. They were boring. They were really, really dull, from my perspective. On every level. Aesthetically, mythologically, just in terms of their character. Not anymore. Not anymore. I like every single one of the new Elven armies, for the simple reason that they've made them more. They've made them more than their influences. They've taken them and abstracted them and made them so much more characterful and interesting. Like the Sylvaneth, for example. The Sylvaneth have a real edge to them now. The fact that they are dryaδιc tree spirits and nature spirits, but with this real dark edge to them. I love that. I absolutely love that. The Idoneth Deepkin are terrifying. Absolutely terrifying. They have this real, I hesitate to use the term, but depth, if you'll forgive the pun, this depth of ambiguity about them, which I love. I absolutely love. And of course we have the Blood Brides of Cain, which were at least some of the more interesting elves back in the AOS days. But even they have this new tension. They have this new tension whereby the god they worship, they openly worship, Cain, is dead. He's gone. Cain is absolutely dead. But Morothai is not telling them that. And she's actually draining all of the power, the worship that they are giving to Cain to fuel her own ascension. That's wonderful. It adds this layer of tension, which I absolutely love. I cannot wait to see what they do with the Elves of Ulgu, for example, the realm of shadow that are under the control of Malerion. I think they will be fascinating. I think they'll be using some of the same technology that they used to create the Night Haunts, where they're all wispy and spectral, but these will be made of smoke and shadow, would be my guess. I cannot wait. I am actually excited for the setting. I don't care that much about the rules, but the rules I like. I do like the rules, but it's the potential for storytelling, for modelling, for just for making it your own, for your own expression. I think that in AOS 2.0 is going to be enormous. And also, I'm interested. I like the background. I've read this book. I have read all of the descriptions of Akshi and Giran and Shyish and Azjaheim and all of these realms, these new realms, and they are fascinating. They're really cool. They have their own characters, they have their own cultures, they have their own architecture, they have their own metaphysics going on, and also the wider metaphysics of this universe. You've got these godly characters striding around who are all like, say, the equivalent of the Emperor in terms of power from the 40k setting, but who are actually in the game, actually at large, like Nagash and to a lesser extent Sigmar. It's wonderful. It's absolutely wonderful, and I hope it continues down this road of just expanding and becoming bigger and more elaborate and interesting and removing itself ultimately from the old world. I think that's inevitable. Whatever affection I and those who came into the game at around the same time, sort of like the late 1980s, early 1990s, have for the old world, it's gone. And it's for the best. It is for the best, as painful as that might be. It's kind of putting down an old dog, you know, who's sick and just needs to go. It's that equivalent. It's gone. And what's in its place is new and vital and is something else. It's something quite... I think it's going to be something quite wonderful. I think it could be something that ultimately comes to rival 40k, again, which it hasn't for a long time, really. 40k has always been the big seller. It's always been the one that people flock to. I think AOS could do it. I think AOS has that potential. So, I mean, the next thing I'm looking forward to is the release of Slaanesh, and that is so coming. That is so coming, ladies and gents. There have been so many hints to that happening, I cannot tell you. But until next time, ladies and gents, please let me know what you think of the new state of play, what you think of AOS in comparison to the old world. I'd be fascinated to hear. But until then, ladies and gents, bye-bye!